On the last episode of the QC Step podcast, we talked about seasonal employment. Now, there's lots of seasonal jobs out there right now, lots of businesses that are hiring. Because there are so many jobs out there, it's easier to get an interview. So on this episode, we're going to talk about interviews. Specifically, we're talking about 3 ways to ace a job interview. We're also going to answer a student-submitted question. This is episode number 96 of the QC Step podcast. Hi, and welcome to the 96th episode of the QC Step podcast. On this episode, we're talking about how to ace a job interview. But before we get to that, we have a student question to answer. This question comes from Rockridge High School, and the student asks, do we need to use a pen to fill out an application? And the answer is absolutely yes. You need to use a pen for paper job applications. You might think that it's better to use a pencil. That way, if you make a mistake, you'll be able to correct your mistake with an answer. Well, even though that makes sense, you still need to use a pen. And not just any pen, but a pen with blue or black ink. If you're worried about making mistakes on a job application with a pen, you should probably ask for an extra application when you go into the business to get one. This is also why you should use a master application. We've talked about master applications here on the QC Step podcast before, but if you don't remember, a master application is a general job application that you fill out with all of your information. And then when you use that application, when you fill out the real job applications, you copy the information from the master application over to the real application. Using a master application will save you some stress when you're filling out job applications. And picking up an extra copy of an application will save you from potentially having to go back into that business and ask for another copy. I mentioned that you should use blue or black ink on an application. You should never, ever use any other color of ink. No purple, no pink, no green, nothing but black or blue. Bright colors or any colors other than black or blue will not make your application stand out. Well, it will stand out, but not in a good way. Ink of any other color other than black or blue looks unprofessional, and it's a real quick way to have your application dismissed without the hiring manager reading a single word on the application. I have one more thing that I'd like to talk about before we get into the main topic of this episode, and that's the Day of Transition 2015. The Day of Transition is a one-day conference that our program does for STEP certified students every year. We'll be sharing more information on the Day of Transition here over the next few weeks on the podcast, but this year it will be on November 10th. Your STEP teacher will be talking with you and sharing information. For the Day of Transition, we have guest speakers and panels that will talk about a variety of aspects of work and post-secondary education. Like I said, you'll be getting more information from your STEP teacher and from me here on the podcast over the next few weeks. On the last episode of the QC Step podcast, we talked about seasonal jobs. If you haven't watched or listened to that yet, go back and check it out. It's episode number 95, and we go over what seasonal jobs are, where you can find them. We talk about how these seasonal jobs are different than regular jobs, and we talk about how seasonal job interviews might be different than regular job interviews. So this week, we're talking about interviews. Businesses, especially retail businesses, they interview a lot of people this time of year. And if you've had trouble getting interviews and you've had trouble getting past that application step in the employment process, then I think your chances to get an interview improve during this seasonal hiring period. So if your chances of getting an interview are higher, then let's do everything that we can for that interview to be successful. And that's why on this episode, I'm going to give you 3 ways to ace a job interview. The first thing you need to do to ace a job interview seems pretty basic, but it's extremely important, and that is you need to prepare. There's a lot of things that you can do to prepare. There's a lot of aspects of preparation, and doing each of these things can help you ace the interview. First off, do your research. I've been in some of your classes and we've talked about how you can use social media like Facebook and Twitter in your job search. If you're applying for businesses, like that business on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Watch their social media posts and you will learn what's important to that business. If they always post about how much they love their customers, then you know that customer service is really important to them and you can use that in the interview. Do your research on the position that you're applying for. Know what the job responsibilities are of that position. Know what the minimum requirements of the job are. Maybe you can do this research by asking someone that you know that works or has worked for that business and ask them about that position. You can also sometimes find this information on the company's website. For instance, if you're applying for a courtesy clerk position at Hy-Vee, you can go to their website, click on that position, and the entire job description is right there. If you don't know anyone that works or has worked for that business, or if you can't find that information on the company's website, then you could just try going to Google. There's lots of resources on employment out there. In fact, you might want to go to Google to prepare for the job interview, whether you have the job description or not. In the past, I've tried to get information on different businesses and their positions and their job applications, and I've come across some websites and some forums where people have shared their interview experiences and even listed out the questions that they were asked in the interview. There's a lot of information out there that can help you in your interview, so do your research. Preparing for an interview means practicing your interview skills. Gary and Carrie, as well as your step teachers, can sit down and do practice interviews with you. It's a good idea to do practice interviews with multiple people so that you can get experience from a few different personalities and a variety of interview questions. My next point goes along with doing practice interviews. Know your answers to the commonly asked interview questions. So how do you know what the commonly asked interview questions are? Well, that's what I cover in episode number 82 of the QC Step podcast. So go to qcstep.com/common questions to get to that episode. Another way that you can prepare is to have your interview outfit ready a day or two ahead of time. Make sure that what you've picked out is appropriate for an interview and make sure it's clean and not wrinkled. If you take care of this type of stuff ahead of time, then you're not going to be stressed out the day of your interview trying to figure out what you're going to wear that day. Figure out your transportation ahead of time. If you don't drive, if you use public transportation, make sure that you know what the bus route is to the business and what time you need to be on the bus. If you'll be getting a ride from someone, make sure that you have that all lined up. Make sure they know what time they need to pick you up, and you should also probably line up some sort of backup ride. If you don't want someone else controlling your ability to get a job, then be prepared with your transportation. The second thing you can do to ace a job interview is to present yourself well. The most important thing is to smile when you meet the person interviewing you. Have a nice, natural smile throughout the interview. You don't have to smile during the entire time, but show them that you're happy to be there and that you're happy to have the opportunity to interview for that position. By smiling, you will give off the vibe that you are a positive person, and every business wants positive people as employees and positive employees interacting with their customers. Presenting yourself well means being outgoing during the interview. Don't answer interview questions with one-word yes or no answers. If it's a yes or a no question, then answer the question and then give them examples or tell them why the answer is yes or why the answer is no. You can be outgoing by asking questions. There will be lots of opportunities to get your questions answered in the interview. You might think that if you ask questions that you're going to look uninformed or that you shouldn't get the job because you're asking a question that someone should know. That is not the case at all. Asking questions shows an interviewer that you're interested enough to find out the answer. You want to know everything about that position and you want to know everything about that business. Asking questions is a great way to be outgoing and to present yourself well. Another way to do this at the end of the interview is to thank the interviewer for their time. Thank them for the opportunity to interview for the position, and while you're doing that, be smiling and offer your hand in a handshake. Ending the interview like that will leave them with a positive perception of you. So now, the third thing that you can do to ace a job interview, and this is something that kind of bleeds over into some of the other things that we've already talked about, but this is big, it's important, and this is something that a student actually told us a few years ago. At the day of transition 2013, we had a student that had been very successful in job interviews, and we had him share some of the things that he had done. We wanted to know, how had he been so successful? And it all came down to this one tip that he had. He said, act like you want the job. It's so basic, but it's so true. If you act like you want the job, you will probably ace the job interview. A lot of teenagers, they go into job interviews nervous or timid. Some might be there just because their parents are making them apply for the job. Maybe they don't even want the job. Maybe they're interviewing just so they can get STEP or co-op class credit. Those people aren't going to act like they want the job. And we've talked on the podcast before that in a way, your answers to the interview questions, those aren't as important as your attitude and as your personality. If you act like you want the job, maybe you mess up on a question in an interview. The interviewer is probably going to remember your attitude and your eagerness to work for their business more than they're going to remember that you didn't have the best answer for a particular question. The student that shared that tip with us is right, I think. Acting like you want the job is the most important thing that you can do in an interview. So those are 3 ways that you can ace a job interview. Prepare for the interview. Do your research. Do your practice interviews. Get your interview outfit ready. Line up your transportation and know the answers to the commonly asked interview questions. Present yourself well with a smile and a solid handshake. Be outgoing, and at the end of the interview, thank them for their time. And most importantly, act like you want the job. If you do those things, you will stand out in an interview compared to some of the others that are interviewing for the position that you want. So give yourself a good shot at getting the job. Do these things, and you will ace that interview. Thanks to the student from Rockridge for sending in the question about ink color to use when you fill out a job application. I don't have any student questions for next week's episode. So if you go to qcstep.com, click on this image, and fill out this form to submit your question. It can be about job applications, it can be about job interviews, or it could be a question about an on-the-job issue. Send it in and we'll talk about it next week. So thanks for watching and listening to this episode, and we will be back next week with episode number 97 of the QC Step podcast.